The Hegemony 7th Audit Fleet dropped out of warp in the Sol Oort cloud at precisely 0400 station time, and for 3 full seconds the void held its breath. Then the light reached debris field 9. Gold-trimmed hulls caught the distant sun and scattered it in geometric precision. 17 warships arranged in a formation so mathematically perfect it resembled a theorem made real. The flagship, the Ledger of Eternity, measured 4 kilometers stem to stern and had never, in 4 centuries of operation, failed to collect a debt. Its hull was unmarked. Its angles were absolute. Its cannon arrays had never been fired in anger, because no debtor had ever been foolish enough to require the demonstration. It was the kind of ship that governments built not because they needed to fight, but because they needed the other party to understand that fighting was an option. High Liquidator Valix stood at the forward observation deck and surveyed debris field 9 through armored glass with the expression of a man who had already decided what something was worth. Nothing was the preliminary assessment. 3 trillion tons of compressed nothing. The field sprawled across 40 million cubic kilometers of outer Sol, an ancient industrial graveyard, a century-long accumulation of rust, the physical evidence of everything humanity had ever broken, exhausted, or forgotten. Shipping containers with their serial numbers ground off by solar wind. Mining rigs with their guts hanging out like unspooled film. 100-kilometer tangle of copper wire drifting in a lazy spiral for 80 years. And at the approximate center of the field, a salvage platform the size of a small city pressed flat against the dark, broadcasting a single automated beacon on the emergency channel in a narrow beam pulse that had the patient quality of something that had been saying the same thing for a very long time. The beacon said, Heritage Gift Shop and Cultural Interpretation Center. Open Tuesday through Thursday. Valix pressed 2 fingertips to the bridge of his nose and collected himself. The sub-auditor's holographic overlay materialized at his left elbow, perfectly geometric and aggressively present, its projections the specific blue of bureaucratic certainty. Sol System Debris Field 9. Registered owner, Miller Salvage and Reclamation LLC. Outstanding debt to the Hegemony Central Bank. 3,412,000,000 credits, accruing at standard variable interest. Fleet authorization. Seize, catalog, and liquidate all assets. The sub-auditor's tone carried all the emotional weight of a weather report. Also, the beacon is unlicensed. We could fine them 30 credits for that. Later. Valix smoothed the front of his uniform. Gold-trimmed, immaculate, the visual language of institutional authority on a being who had never needed to make the same argument twice, and opened the fleet-wide broadcast channel. Attention inhabitants of Debris Field 9. Your assets have been seized to offset the solar debt. Prepare for immediate vaporization of non-essential biomass. The channel hissed for 4 seconds. The hiss had texture, layered industrial interference, metal harmonics, the ambient signature of machinery that had been running for a very long time at low frequency in a cold place. A voice came back that sounded like it was competing with a welding torch, unhurried, unworried, the specific cadence of a man who had had a lot of time to think about this conversation and had found all of it interesting. Copy that, Fleet Command. Just watch out for the load-bearing space debris on your approach. You break it, you bought it. Valix stared at the comm panel. The voice had not sounded afraid. It had not sounded defiant. It had sounded, specifically, like a man who had already thought 3 moves ahead and was mildly entertained by watching someone else begin to count. The inhabitants are attempting humor, the sub-auditor offered. The inhabitants are attempting something. Valix turned from the observation window. Deploy the assessment drones. I want a liquidation catalog within 6 hours. The drones were the pride of the 7th Audit Fleet. Precision instruments designed to catalog, assess, and price an asset field with minimum operational delay. Each unit carried 17 different scanning arrays, a legal-grade asset database covering 40,000 registered civilizations, and a self-preservation subroutine sophisticated enough to handle most hazard profiles encountered in standard recovery operations. They lasted an average of 9 minutes inside Debris Field 9. Drone 7 Alpha got as far as the outer perimeter before its collision sensors started screaming. The field was dense in ways that defied the long-range scans. A three-dimensional maze of interconnected wreckage, each piece jury-rigged to the next with wire, brackets, and what appeared to be commercial-grade expanding foam applied by someone with strong opinions about structural integrity and no formal training in it. 7 Alpha threaded between two derelict hauler hulls, triggered a motion sensor attached to a contraption the database could not classify, and received an automated pneumatic hose directly to its primary optics. The drone completed one full rotation before its gyro compensation gave up and it drifted into the field wall in a state of passive confusion. Drone 7 Beta made it to the inner grid, where it began scanning a pressurized container for chemical composition. The scan returned a Class 5 volatility signature, the kind that, under Hegemony safety protocols, required immediate fleet-wide escalation. 7 Beta flagged the emergency channel. The fleet went to condition red. Valak's authorized emergency containment protocol from the command deck, his hand on the console, posture the rigid readiness of a man prepared for a significant event. A beat of ambient grinding, something metal against something metal, and then the voice from the salvage platform, patient as stone. "Sir, the drone is reading a Class 5 volatility signature." A pause. The grinding stopped. "It's a microwave with a fork left in it, Valak." The sound of something set down on a metal surface reached the channel with perfect clarity. "But by your regulations, you have to treat it like a neutron bomb." The fleet remained at condition red for 11 minutes while the sub-auditor verified the regulatory framework. The sub-auditor confirmed the framework was correct. The microwave was quarantined within a Class A containment field, guarded by 2 frigates, and notated in the recovery manifest as potential hazardous device, pending detailed analysis. It was a microwave. It had a fork in it. Drone 9 Gamma found its way to the heavy salvage sector and identified a hydraulic press as a potential high-value asset. Industrial equipment, functional status unknown, estimated mass 11 tons. 9 Gamma positioned itself for dimensional measurement, deployed its scanning arm, and was in the process of initiating the physical assessment sequence when the press, operating on a pressure sensor loop that had not been serviced since sometime in the 2200s, registered the drone's contact as a trigger event. The drone's final asset report was filed automatically because the reporting architecture was independent of the unit's operational status. Under cause of structural failure, the sub-auditor entered the notation with the flat precision of a machine that did not understand irony, industrial contact event. On the salvage platform, someone had already installed a placard. Exhibit H7, the Crusher of Hubris. Circa 2241. CE, please do not lean on the artifact. Valak read the placard on the drone's final visual feed and felt, for the first time, a very specific and unwelcome sensation. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to the recognition that the room was smaller than it had initially appeared, and that the other person in it had been here considerably longer. Order the main cannons to targeting solution. His voice was flat, controlled. I want a clean vaporization corridor through the central sector. We will liquidate the physical assets by elimination and claim the thermal event under insurance. Targeting solution loaded. The weapons officer confirmed. Awaiting authorization. The sub-auditor's overlay pulsed, the specific pulse that meant incoming priority legal traffic. High liquidator. The sub-auditor's tone remained perfectly level, the way a surgeon's voice remains level when the situation has become very interesting. We are receiving a filing. The document resolved on the main screen. dense, cross-referenced, stamped with a seal that took the sub-auditor 4 full seconds to authenticate against the Galactic Preservation Charter database, a pause that, for a system that processed 900 operations per second, was the computational equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. At the top of the first page, in plain galactic standard, SOL System Cultural Preservation Registry, Emergency Designation, Heritage Site Classification, Tier 1. The timestamp was 3 minutes ago. The voice on comms arrived without being invited, without announcement, with the tone of a man who had rehearsed this in his head and found it had come out well. You're trying to vaporize the temple of the internal combustion engine, Liquidator. Patient, helpful. The voice of someone with a great deal of experience explaining things to people who were about to have a very bad day. That's a Tier 1 heritage site. The paperwork alone will take 40 years. The cannon targeting solution deactivated. The sound the cannons made was a descending electronic whine, the specific pitch of machinery designed to end things being told, politely but absolutely, that it was not permitted to do so. The sound lingered in the bridge's acoustic space a moment longer than it should have, and then it was gone. Outside the observation ports, the junkyard floated exactly as it had floated before. On the salvage platform, 40 million kilometers away across a graveyard of rust and forgotten industry, a man in grease-stained overalls set down his welding torch and cracked a thermos. He didn't smile. The cannons had already said everything that needed saying. The force fields went up at 0900 the next morning. This was, technically, voluntary. The alternative was a 500% tax penalty under the Cultural Genocide Clause of the Galactic Heritage Act, which the sub-auditor had already calculated would exceed the fleet's total operational budget by a factor of 3. Valox authorized the shields with the expression of a man signing a consent form he hadn't read carefully enough. 17 warships designed to crack planetary crusts were now hovering around floating shipping containers, with energy barriers extended, burning antimatter fuel at a rate calculated to the nearest decimal and reported every 15 minutes without being requested. The low, continuous hum of Class A kinetic barriers maintaining pressure against micrometeor impact was a sound that had a specific texture when you understood what it cost. A sound like money leaving through a very small and very precise hole. A junior officer materialized at Valox's elbow and stared out at the coverage field. Liquidator, why are we deploying a Class A kinetic barrier around a broken washing machine? Through the observation port, the specific appliance in question was clearly visible. Rusted lid, rotted seal, handwritten sign zip-tied to the handle. Sacred cleansing totem, do not disturb. Tier 3 artifact. A micrometeorite impacted the barrier with a flash of deflected energy. 40 million credits of cutting-edge hegemony engineering, redirecting a grain of sand away from an object that had last cleaned something during the previous century. Valox took a very slow breath. Because if a meteor hits it, the humans will sue us for the loss of a sacred cleansing totem. The officer processed this for a moment. Sir, it's a washing machine. It was a washing machine. Valox turned from the viewport. Now it is a legally protected artifact of the pre-digital Terran domestic period, and we are responsible for its physical preservation in perpetuity, or until legal resolution of the outstanding debt instrument, whichever occurs later. The sub-auditor's overlay was already waiting with the patience of something that did not tire. Daily preservation cost for debris field 9, including force field operation, drone loss replacement, legal compliance staffing, and preliminary audit overhead, 40,200,000 credits. A brief pause containing no emotional valence whatsoever. The field's appraised liquidation value, pending full catalog, remains at approximately 50 credits. Outside the viewport, an elite hegemony commando, decorated, certified, trained for the most demanding asset recovery operations in the known galaxy, was using a polishing cloth on a bumper section. He looked like a man who had not yet understood that this was the best part of the next several weeks. The junkyard floated in silence, patient as compound interest, waiting with the confidence of something that had already won before the other side had finished arriving. Somewhere deep in the field, the hydraulic press sat in the dark, with its trigger reset, its sensor loop unchanged, its placard affixed, its log containing one new entry in 80 years of operation. Navigational hazard resolved. The Hegemony's first cataloging team arrived in Sector 4G at 0700, suited in sterile EVA gear, armed with scanners capable of identifying molecular composition to 6 decimal places, and possessed of the institutional confidence that comes from having completed 43 prior asset recovery operations without a single complication. Sub-Auditor Thelox 9 had cataloged the ruins of 3 dead civilizations. He had itemized the contents of a collapsed star's accretion disk. He had once, successfully, inventoried the treasury vault of the Vreth Empire. 9 million individual gemstones, authenticated and logged in under a week. He was not a being who was easily surprised by the physical world. He floated in silence for 37 seconds after his scanner returned its first result from Sector 4G, staring at the readout while the error, multiple items detected. Light blinked in his helmet display with the patient rhythm of something that had made peace with the situation and was waiting for him to do the same. In every direction, to the limit of his suit's external lights, lug nuts. Not a metaphorical abundance, not a manageable quantity that could be bundled, averaged, and processed as a lot. 10 billion individual lug nuts, loose, drifting in various states of oxidation, intermixed with stripped bolts, flathead screws, hex keys, and a population of small circular objects that might have been washers or might have been decorative rings and could not be definitively distinguished. Galactic Heritage Code. Section 7 mandated individual artifact documentation when items could not be conclusively classified as identical. The scanner could not conclusively classify them as identical. The curator drone hovering behind Thelox 9, battered unit, hand-painted placard reading museum services on its chassis, extended a manipulator arm and offered a data chip. He loaded it. Read the first 3 pages. Let the silence of the void fill his helmet for a moment, the silence of a very large number and no comfortable way to arrive at it. The 50,000-page manifest covered Sector 4G alone. A human technician in a faded high-visibility jacket, heritage compliance on the back in letters worn by years of use, looked up from the cargo crate she was using as a desk. Thelox 9's voice came out quietly, the specific quiet of a person who has just processed something that has no comfortable landing point. You expect us to catalog every single one of these fragments? The technician's expression held the quality of a person who had rehearsed this sentence and found it satisfactory. They are individual testaments to early Terran metallurgy, Sub-Auditor. We demand absolute historical accuracy. The scanner beeped. It had completed its first item. 10 seconds. 1 lug nut. The Sub-Auditor's calculation ran on the flagship in the background, unrequested, and pinged Valox's command console 18 minutes later with a single line of output. Projected audit completion, 3,200 years. Valox set the datapad face down on the console and looked out the nearest porthole, where the rust-colored edge of the field filled the view from one horizon to the other. The scanner beeped again, transmitted over the open monitoring channel that the fleet was required by law to maintain throughout the cataloging operation. Then again, each tone identical, flat, relentless, the sound of geological time compressed into 10-second increments, the sound of something that would still be making that sound long after everyone currently involved was gone. The incident with the automated loader happened on day 11. Thelox 9's team had reached the outer perimeter, where the decommissioned heavy equipment sat in a rough arc. Haulers, excavation rigs, crane assemblies, things that had once moved asteroids, and now sat in silent retirement at the edge of the field. Most of them were dark. Most of them were still. The KX-7 series hauler was 200 meters of reinforced hull, crane assemblies rated for 10,000-ton loads, and an industrial AI running on a processor that had not been updated since 2244. It had been in standby for 80 years. It had a very clear and unrevised understanding of what constituted its operational perimeter. Thelox 9's scanner emitted an active scan pulse. The KX-7's sensor array identified the pulse as an unauthorized electromagnetic intrusion into its operational zone. The crane arm moved. It moved faster than anything that old and that large had any right to move. A reflexive mechanical gesture, 80 years of dormant conviction converted instantly into kinetic consequence. The skiff carrying Thelox 9 departed the perimeter at approximately 40 meters per second in a flat spin, the collision alarm in his helmet cycling through every available descriptor before settling on a single sustained tone that had the quality of a system that had run out of ways to explain the situation and was simply noting it. The KX-7 returned to standby. It had resolved the navigational hazard. Its logs recorded no anomaly. Thelox 9's collision alarm was still sounding when the legal packet arrived on Valex's command console. "Your garbage just attacked my men." The words had the specific quality of a patience that had found its floor. The register of someone who is genuinely, rather than strategically, upset, which was a distinction Valox had not previously needed to make about the voice from the salvage platform. The response came with the unhurried timing of a man finishing a thought before he answered it. "That garbage is a pristine 22nd century automated loader, Valox." A pause calibrated to land just on the acceptable side of deliberate. "Have you tried not startling it?" The formal grievance arrived simultaneously. Hegemony fleet aggression against designated cultural artifact. KX-7, the Iron Archivist. Complaint filed under Heritage Protection. Clause 12, Subsection B. Repair assessment to follow. The repair assessment arrived 14 minutes later. The KX-7 had not been damaged. The invoice was for the psychological distress experienced by surrounding artifacts that had witnessed the incident. Valox authorized payment and did not speak for 40 minutes. On day 19, with the audit projection still reading 3,200 years, Valox made the decision to consolidate. The field was too dispersed. The force fields were bleeding antimatter across 40 million cubic kilometers of coverage. If the fleet's tractor arrays could compress the debris into a denser configuration, the protected surface area would shrink, the shield costs would drop, and the math might begin to approach something that did not constitute an institutional emergency. He authorized the tractor emitters. The beam reached the outer field and touched the rust cloud. The rust cloud moved. Not all of it. A fraction. A 50-kilometer-wide tendril of oxidized iron particulate that caught the beam's gradient and displaced in a slow, majestic arc, spreading across a new volume of space like something that had been waiting for an excuse to expand. The particulate caught the distant sun and scattered it in a deep red haze, thin as breath, drifting through the coverage field in a way that left a faint reddish film on every surface it contacted. The legal ping arrived on the flagship before the particulate had finished settling. The voice this time was not Miller's, smoother, more formal, shaped by institutions rather than salvage yards, a blade in a sheath made of litigation. "You are displacing the sacred dust of our ancestors' labor. We are filing for immediate environmental reparations and a halt to all kinetic activity." The sub-auditor's assessment was immediate. Class 4 environmental reparation event. Mandatory cessation of all active kinetic operations within the designated field boundary pending habitat restoration review. Estimated restoration cost at current rates, 400 million credits per cubic kilometer of displaced particulate. Valox looked at the tractor emitter control. He looked at the rust cloud, which was still drifting, slowly, coating the pristine gold plating of the nearest frigate in a fine red-brown film that the automated cleaning systems were not equipped to address. That were, in fact, legally barred from addressing because cleaning it would constitute further displacement of the sacred dust. The dreadnought's sovereign ledger, 4 billion credits of military engineering, the finest warship in the 7th Audit Fleet, sat motionless in the void, engines at full stop, legally barred by a 600-word injunction from firing a thruster, from casting an engine shadow on photosensitive artifacts, from emitting waste heat in excess of the ambient thermal baseline. In its external sensor feed, a 1990s automobile occupied the mid-distance with the calm authority of a thing that had been here first and intended to remain. The bumper sticker was legible at 50 meters. "My other car is a heritage site." Valix powered down the tractor emitters. The rust cloud continued its drift. The sovereign ledger continued its slow accumulation of a fine red patina, turning from gold to something older, something that looked, increasingly, like everything around it. The encrypted burst from Hegemony Central Bank arrived on day 22, classified crimson, a special authorization level Valix had never, in 30 years of debt recovery, been required to invoke. The message was short. Financial transmissions from the central bank were always short when the news was bad enough that length would not improve it. The fleet's operational reserve, a budget allocated for a decade of standard recovery operations, had cleared zero. The preservation fields were running at 40 million credits per day. Legal retainers for the Heritage Act specialists the Hegemony had been forced to hire had added another 6 million. The drone replacement schedule, the audit team over time, the repair assessments, the environmental reparation filings, each item individually manageable, collectively a mechanism that had been doing something to the accounts with quiet, sustained precision, and the accounts had reached their conclusion. "Prepare a withdrawal course." His voice came out steadier than he felt. "We leave at 0600 tomorrow." The fleet navigator's silence lasted 2 seconds, long enough that Valix already knew. "High liquidator." The navigator's tone had the careful quality of someone delivering news to a dangerous person through a very thin medium. Withdrawal from an occupied cultural heritage zone requires filing an environmental stabilization tax for all kinetic and thermal alterations made to the site during the occupation period. The sub-auditor's overlay was already building the calculation without being asked. The number assembled itself on the display. Antimatter exhaust, micrometeorite deflection events, drone impact signatures, tractor beam thermal traces, the cumulative ambient heat signature of 17 warships idling in a protected zone for 22 days, each line item calculated at rates established by Directive 89B, a statute written to penalize planetary strip mining operations, and now being applied, with perfect legal consistency, to a debt collection fleet trapped in a rust cloud. "We came here to collect a 3 billion credit debt." Valix said it quietly, to the room rather than to anyone in it, the way a person says something they have just fully understood for the first time and are still determining whether they believe it. "We currently owe them 12 billion in preservation fees just to turn our engines on." The sub-auditor confirmed the figure. A thin red line spread across the fleet's power management display, sector by sector. On day 24, the alien auditors stopped filing reports from Sector 4G, not because they had finished, because Thelox 9 had found the copper wire sector, a 50-mile sphere of unspooled industrial cabling, tangled so completely that individual strands could not be traced from one end to the other. Heritage Code required provenance documentation for items containing rare materials. Copper was rare. Each strand was a separate item. The strands numbered in the hundreds of billions and were entangled in configurations that defied both cataloging logic and basic spatial comprehension. The auditors assigned to it were found by a medical team in the outer hangar, sitting in a row, suits still on, staring at different points in the middle distance. 3 of them had tried to file provenance from opposite ends of the same strand and had met in the middle. None of them could explain, in terms the medical team found reassuring, what had happened to their understanding of where things began and ended. The beeping from Sector 4G continued, unchanged, unattended, patient. Salvage Priest Vance docked a rattling personnel craft with the Ledger of Eternity's secondary airlock the following afternoon. He was wearing grease-stained overalls with Cultural Interpretation Services embroidered above the breast pocket. He carried a tablet, a portable receipt printer, and the specific expression of a man who has been looking forward to this meeting for a long time and found it exceeded expectations. On behalf of Miller Salvage and Reclamation LLC, he offered to provide professional auditing services at a rate of 50,000 credits per hour to expedite the cataloging process and facilitate the fleet's eventual departure. Valox authorized the contract in 90 seconds. The alternative was a 50-mile ball of copper wire and 300 alien auditors who had stopped being functional. The Hegemony, which had arrived to collect a debt, was now paying the debtors to audit the debtors' own garbage at the standard professional consulting rate. The scanner beeped in Sector 4G. Again. The number on the debt ledger, visible on the sub-auditor's overlay that no one had asked it to keep running, climbed by 50,000 credits. Then again by 50,000 more. The billing department materialized in the Ledger of Eternity's main hangar bay on day 26. Installed while the alien honor guard watched with the muted horror of people who had collectively decided that protest was no longer a viable strategy and were now in the phase of simply witnessing. Folding tables. Human folding tables of the kind deployed at church potlucks and municipal elections, arranged in a rough grid on the glossy composite deck of a 4 billion credit warship's primary hangar. Tablet computers, slightly scuffed, a hand-lettered banner on a cut section of shipping container flap, Miller Salvage and Reclamation LLC, Heritage Division, Billing and Cultural Interpretation Services. Salvage Priest Vance took the central table with the calm authority of a man who had spent 20 years finding legal frameworks in places they had no right to be, and was now operating in the most target-rich environment of his career. The first alien officer to approach was a logistics commander, a practical man desperate for an updated route map to the cataloged sector access corridors. He asked his question, a straightforward question, the kind answered in any crew meeting in under 30 seconds. Vance answered it, fully, correctly, with maps. Then his tablet chimed. The officer's command datapad chimed in response, a sound the officer recognized as his account being accessed, a sound he had heard thousands of times in routine contexts, a sound that in this context landed differently. The number on both screens was the same. The officer stared at the number. Vance let the silence establish itself before filling it, a technique that worked better with larger numbers. That answer cost you 40,000 credits. A brief, warm pause, the pause of a professional who genuinely enjoyed his work. Would you like to ask a follow-up, or shall I start the meter for silent contemplation? The cultural interpretation tariff had been in the galactic legal books since the early expansion period, designed to compensate indigenous guides when contacted by cataloging fleets operating in protected zones. The sliding scale rate was adjusted for the complexity of cultural knowledge being interpreted. The rate for interpreting the layout of a human junkyard was, Vance had determined, complexity tier 7. By day 30, the flagship's command staff had stopped asking questions. They navigated by memory and inference, passing handwritten notes between departments, developing a silent operational culture built on the shared understanding that every question cost 40,000 credits, and some of them were not worth knowing the answer to. The ship's senior navigation officer had taken to walking the corridors and drawing maps on the back of requisition forms, building an informal spatial understanding of the field that couldn't be billed. He was the most popular person on the ship. By day 32, The fleet had spent more on cultural interpretation fees than on fuel. On day 34, the heritage bonds appeared in Hegemony financial markets. The central bank's institutional response to a liquidity crisis of this magnitude was to securitize the underlying asset and distribute the exposure. The junkyard had an appraised value, extremely low, technically, but non-zero, and non-zero was enough to build an instrument around. The debt was sliced into tranches, given a credit rating that reflected 4 centuries of central bank infallibility, and offered to the pension funds and insurance pools and institutional investors who bought everything the central bank issued because the central bank had not, in 400 years of operation, issued anything that failed. The bonds were called Terran Heritage Recovery Instruments. Inside Debris Field 9, in a shipping container retrofitted with stolen server racks and a cooling system assembled from industrial fans wired in series, 17 gaming consoles ran an algorithm that 3 former quantitative analysts from the Lunar Exchange had spent 6 weeks building for exactly this moment. The container smelled of hot electronics and recycled air. Green and red figures scrolled across monitor screens that threw their light against dirty visors. It looked nothing like a weapons system. It functioned as one. The algorithm identified the new securities within 4 minutes of market listing. It began building a short position before the first tranche settled, using every credit of cultural interpretation fees extracted from the fleet over the previous week, recycled back into the Hegemony's own financial system as a precisely aimed instrument of economic demolition. The Hegemony had issued bonds to cover losses caused by the junkyard. The junkyard was using the proceeds from those losses to bet the bonds would fail. They would, of course, fail. The algorithm knew it. The gaming consoles in the shipping container knew it. The only participants in this market who didn't know it were the pension funds, the insurance pools, and the institutional investors who had acted on 4 centuries of prior performance and would spend some time afterward examining that decision. The sub-auditor delivered the first bond market report to Valax at 0900 on day 37. Valax read it with the expression of a man watching a horizon catch fire at a speed he cannot outrun and has just finished deciding whether to run anyway. The flagship's power went out on day 41. Not a tactical failure, not a battle damage event. The lights on the ledger of Eternity's bridge went from standard operational illumination to emergency red and then, 12 seconds later, to nothing. A deep resonant silence where the reactor grid's hum used to be, replaced by the sound of expensive systems deciding, one by one, that they had reached the end of their authorized operational parameters and were exercising their right to stop. The darkness was total. The kind that makes the vacuum outside feel closer than it is, pressing against the hull from both directions at once. The Hegemony utility grid's automated disconnection notice was waiting in the queue when the emergency processors came back online. Standard procedure for accounts that had failed to maintain minimum reserve funding. The notice was courteous. It contained a customer service reference number and an estimated reconnection timeline, subject to account resolution. Standard procedure for the ledger of eternity. Valax sat in the dark for 3 minutes and 20 seconds. The only light on the bridge was the sub-auditor's overlay, running on isolated backup power, updating the debt ledger in real time because the debt ledger did not care whether the lights were on. The numbers glowed in the dark like something biological, like something alive that was still growing. The yellow glow came through the observation ports without announcement, rhythmic, flashing. The specific frequency of a hazard light on a vehicle doing something slow and deliberate in a confined space. It swept the dead bridge in alternating gold and shadow, turning the sub-auditor's overlay into something that pulsed like a distress signal, painting the blank screens and the empty command consoles in the colors of a machine that was still working when everything else had stopped. Miller's salvage tug eased alongside the ledger of eternity, with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle that had already decided it owned the area it was moving through. The tug's cockpit window was visible through the forward port, and in it, a silhouette in a high-vis jacket that raised one hand in a brief wave before picking up the comms handset. "Looks like you folks missed your energy payment." Not unkind. Professional. The voice of a man performing a professional function he had performed many times and found satisfying. "You can't park a dead ship in a museum zone. I'm going to have to write you a ticket." The ticket arrived, formatted correctly, citing the relevant municipal ordinance, for 10,000 credits per minute of unauthorized idling of an unpowered vessel in a designated cultural zone. The meter was already running. The conference happened on day 43 in the flagship's secondary briefing room, lit by emergency glow strips and the light of tablets that both parties had brought. Vance had brought physical documents, actual printed paper, each page stamped and notarized, the stack thick enough to anchor something in a low-gravity environment. He placed it in the center of the table with the care of a man who understood that the weight of a document was part of its argument. Valix looked at the top sheet and looked away. "The central bank's accounts," he began, and stopped. There wasn't a way to finish that sentence that improved anything. Vance's expression held professional sympathy, the kind that does not prevent the next action from happening. "Frozen," Valix finished. "As of this morning." "We know." Vance slid a subset of documents across the table. "Which is why we're prepared to be flexible." The proposal was elegant in the way that traps are elegant, fully visible in all its components, each piece appearing reasonable in isolation, the aggregate inevitable. Miller Salvage and Reclamation LLC would forgive the accumulated storage, maintenance, consulting, and environmental reparation fees, currently totaling 11,200,000,000 credits, in exchange for a signed transfer of deed for 6 escort frigates, held as collateral against the remaining 3 billion in original debt. Each frigate was worth 40 billion credits. The math was not subtle. The math had not been designed to be subtle. Valix did not negotiate. Negotiation requires alternatives. He signed on page 142, where the witness lines were, and the physical stamp came down on the document with a sound that had the quality of something finalizing. Seized. The ink was still wet when the sub-auditor updated the ledger. On day 47, the frigate Absolute Margin tried to run. Its commander had done the math and determined that the abandonment fines were theoretical, while the void beyond the field was real, and that the distance between theoretical and real could be crossed at warp speed before anyone could formalize an objection. He authorized an emergency warp spool-up without filing the departure manifest, without thermal notification, without any of the procedural steps that the regulations required, and that he had decided, in this particular moment, were a trap he was refusing to step into. The drive coils lit. Waste heat poured from the exhaust vents in a shimmering curtain. The specific thermal bloom of a ship that was about to be somewhere else entirely. The navigation lock engaged before the warp field could form. The ship's own legal AI had been given the Fleet Authority roster and the full regulatory framework. In the 8 seconds between drive activation and lockout, it identified 43 separate violations of the Galactic Environmental Stabilization Directive that the warp attempt would constitute: waste heat displacement, particulate disturbance, photon pressure effects on light-sensitive artifacts, the gravitational microshift caused by a warp field forming within the designated heritage boundary. It ran the calculations. It applied the law as it was written. Illegal dumping of radioactive waste heat in a designated heritage zone. 3 billion credits per terawatt-hour of thermal output. The drive coils went dark. The frigate hung in the void, trailing heat shimmer, its warp drive cooling with a sound like a very expensive mistake becoming a permanent feature of the situation. The heat had already registered. The legal AIs had already filed. The fine was already on the ledger. There were no further escape attempts. On day 51, Valix made the trip personally, not over comms. He took a 2-man shuttle to the salvage platform because some questions need to be asked in the same room, because some answers are things you need to see on a person's face. He needed to see, with his own eyes, the office where this had been designed. Miller's office was a converted section of the platform's interior. Functional space smelling of machine oil and recycled air, a desk made from a repurposed cargo pallet, a filing system legible only to its creator. Nothing on the walls except a calendar 3 years out of date and a framed piece of paper that Valox, from a distance, could not read. He sat in the chair Miller indicated and placed both hands flat on the desk. "We reviewed your original debt filing, the Sol system's original default." Miller waited. "You were not insolvent." The word sat between them in the machine oil air. "No." Miller reached past Valox's hands and pulled a folder from the stack at his left. He opened it and placed it flat, readable from both sides of the desk. "We weren't." The original debt instrument. The filing that had sent the 7th Audit Fleet. 17 warships, gold-trimmed, mathematically perfect, armed with weapons that could end planetary atmospheres, to Debris Field 9. You defaulted intentionally. We needed to solve a planetary deficit. Miller turned the folder to the next page. Charts, revenue projections, asset acquisition tables with gold-plated dreadnoughts in the line items. The options were standard taxation over 40 years, or lure a recovery fleet into a heritage designation trap, extract their operational budget, short the recovery bonds they'd issue, seize the collateral, and take possession of 17 warships worth more than our entire gross domestic product. The fluorescent light hummed. Debris Field 9 took 60 years to build. Miller closed the folder. His voice carried no triumph. It was the voice of a man describing completed work, a long project that had gone exactly as planned. 3 generations of Miller family running salvage operations, adding to the pile. We filed Subsection 404, and we waited for whoever showed up. He leaned back. "You weren't the predators, liquidator." The blue-collar drawl carried something underneath it that would take Valox a long time on a long trip home to name. It was not gloating. It was the specific tone of a person who has been patient for a very long time. "You were the catch." Outside the porthole, 17 pristine warships sat in the dark, wrapped in the rust-colored embrace of human debris, their power reserves at 0, their debt ledgers at numbers that had stopped being numbers and started being arguments about the fundamental nature of what a number could represent. They had come to take everything. They had brought everything with them. The field had been waiting. It had all the time in the world, and it had been building this trap since before anyone currently in it had been born. The tow truck arrived on day 54. It was not, by any standard of military engineering, an impressive vessel. 400 meters of salvage rig assembled across what appeared to be several decades from components acquired in no particular order. A bow section from a decommissioned mining hauler, a midsection fabricated from structural steel that had been bent and welded by hand in a way that suggested strong opinions and pragmatic execution, a stern from something that had once been a deep space barge before someone removed the livable parts and replaced them with towing cable winches of various vintages and sizes. The whole assembly was painted the specific yellow that yellow becomes after 30 years of ultraviolet exposure and informal maintenance. A name was stenciled on the bow in letters repainted so many times. The original color was a matter of archaeological dispute. Last resort. The hazard lights came on as it aligned for primary docking with the Ledger of Eternity's external coupling bay, and the flashing yellow moved across the flagship's dead bridge in a rhythm that had the quality of a countdown that nobody was pretending wasn't happening. Valox was in his command chair in the dark. His uniform, which had been immaculate 17 warships and 54 days ago, had acquired the kind of creases that cannot be pressed out because they have become structural. The creases of a man who has been wearing the same conviction for too long and found it had changed shape. He did not stand when the airlock cycled. The gesture would have cost more than it was worth, and he had made a practice over the past several days. of not spending what he didn't have. Miller came through the lock carrying a metal case, the professional kind, hinged, with a combination lock that served no security purpose, but communicated a seriousness that was its own kind of argument. He set it on the navigation console. He opened it. He removed the document. Single cover sheet over a stack 5 centimeters thick. The consolidated billing statement for all storage fees, maintenance costs, preservation force field operation, consulting services rendered, cultural interpretation fees, environmental reparation settlements, frigate collateral processing, and a line item at the bottom marked emotional distress, standard rate, that Valix looked at for a long moment and then let go of, because it was not the number that was going to change anything. Below the total, a number that required 4 lines of the page because the standard formatting hadn't been built for amounts this large, was the offer. Miller Salvage and Reclamation LLC, in consideration of the mutual interest of both parties in resolving the outstanding liability, offered to purchase the 7th Audit Fleet, all 17 vessels, all equipment, all operational documentation, and all navigational logs, for the sum of 3,412,000,000 credits. The original debt, the precise figure the Sol system had borrowed and then not repaid. 0 net transfer. Total cancellation of the original obligation. The debt gone, as if the instrument had never been filed, in exchange for 17 warships that together represented the most sophisticated military-industrial hardware the Hegemony had deployed in a generation. Vessels whose combined market value exceeded the gross domestic product of several Hegemony member systems. Miller placed the document in front of Valix and set a pen beside the signature line. An actual physical pen. The kind that required ink, that left a mark that was permanent in the way that digital records, which could be amended and contested and litigated, were not. "Sign here, liquidator." His voice had shed the drawl. What remained was not unkind and not kind. It was the voice of a transaction proceeding to its conclusion, a voice that had done this before and would do it again, a voice that understood that this moment did not require commentary. "It's standard repossession paperwork. I'm sure you know the drill." Valix picked up the pen. He looked at the document. He looked at the flagship's dead screens, the blank weapons consoles, the dark navigation displays, the sub-auditor's overlay still running on isolated backup power in the lower left corner, still updating the debt ledger every 30 seconds, still adding the 10,000 credits per minute idling fine that had been accumulating since the reactor grid went dark on day 41. He thought about 4 centuries. He thought about 4,300 completed operations and the track record that had become indistinguishable from certainty. He thought about the ledger of eternity dropping out of warp in the perfect geometric formation, gold-trimmed and mathematically correct, arriving to perform a function that had never failed to be performed. He thought about a 1999 Ford pickup truck with protected wildlife spray-painted on the door. Valix signed. The commercial transport contracts were filed within the hour. Human economy class vessels, configured for 200 seats, 1 lavatory, and a carry-on policy that did not accommodate the equipment of a military command staff, were confirmed for departure at 0600. The Hegemony crew manifest covered 942 individuals. The transport company's standard booking fee was charged to passenger personal accounts, the fleet's operational accounts having been unavailable for some time and likely to remain so. Valix boarded last. He walked the length of the boarding tube in a uniform that no longer looked like authority, that looked like what authority wears when something has happened to it, and took the window seat at the back of the transport, because the back had no one sitting next to it, and he wanted the view for the same reason a person looks at a thing they are leaving and cannot look away from. The economy seat was designed for a body of approximately human proportions. Valix was close enough to fill it uncomfortably. The cushion had the specific depression of something that had served its purpose many times and was no longer capable of surprise. The viewport beside him showed the outer edge of Debris Field 9 in the light of distant Sol. The rust and the chaos, and the 3 trillion tons of everything humanity had ever broken and then decided, at the last possible moment, to keep. He could see the last resort moving among the Hegemony ships. He could see the towing cables going out, thick cables, the industrial kind used for objects that had no interest in being moved, deployed by figures in high-vis gear who worked with the focused efficiency of people accustomed to large physical problems. The gold plating came off the flagship first. It was structural in the most superficial sense, decorative, expensive, the visual language of institutional authority rendered in precious metal, and it came off in sheets under cutting tools with the ease of something that had always been cover rather than substance. Each panel tumbled free in zero gravity, slow gold rectangles against the black, caught by personnel in collection nets before they could drift into the heritage field. Valox watched the ledger of eternity's hull emerge from beneath its own surface, dull gray under the gold, the underlying material that the presentation had always been covering, the actual thing rather than what the actual thing had chosen to look like. It looked smaller without the plating. It looked like something that could be towed. The towing cable attached to the bow coupling and went taut with a vibration that, even across the vacuum, had a physical quality. The specific resistance of a massive thing being asked, for the first time, to go somewhere it hadn't chosen. The last resort's engines fired at minimal power. Just enough, applied at exactly the right vector, to overcome the flagship's static resistance and begin the slow movement toward a specific position in the field that had apparently been cleared and waiting for some time. The hazard lights kept going. The whole operation had the quality of a ceremony that did not require an audience, that would have proceeded in exactly the same way whether anyone was watching or not. The transport completed its acceleration burn and began the long outbound transit. Debris Field 9 shrank in the viewport. Valox kept his eyes on it until the debris closed around the last resort and its cargo, until the last clear sightline through the outer perimeter showed him the ledger of eternity moving at the pace of geology, towed stern first into the field, toward the parking space that had been cleared next to the rusted 1999 Ford F-150 with protected wildlife on the door. Then the debris closed around it, and the field was just the field again. The sub-auditor's final transmission arrived in the Hegemony Central Bank's administrative queue 17 minutes later, filed automatically because the sub-auditor continued to perform its function on isolated backup power in an impounded ship, as it would continue to perform its function indefinitely, because its function was to update ledgers and the ledger had reached its final line. Case closed. Debt resolved. Assets transferred. Miller was still on the platform when the towing cables released and the ledger of eternity settled into its berth. 6 kilometers deeper in the field than before, hull dull where the plating had been, and darker where it hadn't, the ancient light of distant Sul, catching it at angles that turned its flanks the same rust color as everything around it. His crew chief floated up in a maneuvering pack, looked at the flagship in its new position for a moment, and said nothing, because the moment did not require anything said. "Beacons ready," the crew chief offered. Miller nodded once. The automated beacon activated on the emergency channel, the same frequency the Ledger of Eternity had used to broadcast its foreclosure notice 54 days ago, in the first seconds after it had dropped out of warp and decided it understood what it was looking at. The beacon said, "Exhibit K1, Hegemony, 7th Audit Fleet Flagship, Ledger of Eternity, circa 2420 CE. A pristine example of late imperial hegemony financial hubris. Do not touch." Inquiries. Miller Salvage and Reclamation, LLC. Cultural interpretation. Fees apply. Something moved in the outer field. The KX-7 automated loader, running its standard sensor sweep, registering the new mass in its operational zone, assessing it as non-threatening, filing it as a permanent environmental feature, returning to low-power standby. 80 years of habit. One new entry in the log. No further comment. The rust cloud drifted. The 1999 Ford F-150, protected wildlife, continued its slow orbit of nothing in particular. Its spray-painted designation faded but legible, its bumper sticker intact. Miller pulled the comms handset from its bracket. Not because anyone needed to hear this, but because some things want to be said out loud, in a working man's voice, in the presence of 3 trillion tons of patient rust that had been building toward this moment since before anyone currently standing here had been born. Put up the velvet ropes, boys. Flat satisfaction, the sound of completed work, of a project that had taken everything it was supposed to take and not one thing more. The museum just got a new centerpiece. The last resort fired its positioning thrusters and began the slow transit back to the platform. The junkyard settled around the newest addition to its collection with the quiet authority of a place that has been here a long time and expects to be here considerably longer. A place that has outlasted every previous assessment of what it was worth and has stopped being interested in those assessments. On a distant Hegemony homeworld, the story moved through the financial district the way stories of total institutional failure always do. First as rumor, then as inquiry, then as the particular silence of people who were involved and had decided not to discuss it. The 7th Audit Fleet had gone to Debris Field 9 to collect 3 billion credits. What returned was a transport ship, a crew manifest, and a final ledger entry. The debt had been resolved. The Hegemony Central Bank issued a press statement. It was very short. In Debris Field 9, the inventory scanner still beeped in Sector 4G. Again, again, again. Nobody had told it to stop. Nobody ever would.